Hi, Both, and welcome to Media Hack Vodcast. Every day this week, we'll be bringing you the latest gossip, hot takes, and expert views on what's happening with the SU elections. Today, we have Francesco with us, the current SU president, and we'll be asking him about all the trials and tribulations of running campaigns based on his experience before exploring the big issues president candidates are chatting about this year, including the post-COVID revival of the SU and candidates' approaches to the free speech controversies facing universities in the UK. I'm Antigone, Campus TV station manager, and today I'm joined by our media officer Glenn and Millie from Bath Time.
Hi, Antigone. Yeah, really excited by today. Should be a good crack. So yeah, as you said, I'm Glenn from the media officer this year. I have run campaigns every other year that I've been at university. So it's quite nice to be on the sidelines, commentating on everyone and just sharing honest views and not having to back someone, which is quite cool. A little bit different, no horse in the race, but good fun.
Yeah, and I'm Millie. This should be really fun. I study modern languages and European studies, and I am the multimedia news editor this year. So involved in these kind of projects, trying to get our news coverage across platforms. I haven't been involved in any campaigning before. So what I find quite interesting in these campaigns is translating all the promises and all the talk and all the jargon into what it means for students and trying to understand that as someone who isn't so involved in the SU bubble. So yeah, I think we'll have some really interesting discussions today.
For sure. And obviously our guest today is Francesco, current president, previous activities officer, and SU veteran really. So very happy to have you with us today.
I'm really happy to be here. I think very much like Glenn, I'm very happy to be on the sidelines this time and like see how it works on the other side. Because for 3 years in a row I've been one of the horses in the race this finally I get to sit back and just like watch it happen and see the work that people behind the scenes are doing, which is absolutely incredible. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here.
Very happy to have you. Well, yeah, let's just crack on. I have a few questions for you. So let's do this, okay? So after two successful campaigns, and almost 2 years in office, you should have a lot of experience when it comes to, campaign strategies and how all of that kind of works. First of all, how was your experience and how do you think it's different now that everything is online? And what would you do if you had to do it online as well?
Very interesting question there, because the way that I learned and that I was taught how to campaign heavily depended on that physical element as well. And the whole thing that about my first campaign in 2018 when I ran for community officer, when Glenn was on the opponent's team, actually, I was not out there enough in person because I didn't really know what I was doing. So I just kind of like put my videos up, but then kind of like chill, hang out in the plug with my campaign team. And after that, after I lost, and people were like, "Why?" And I was thinking, "Why did I lose?" People were like, "Well, you just were not out there enough." So for the future campaigns, I kind of made sure that I was flashed out and I was out there as much as I could on parade, knocking doors, in halls, going to events. It's all part of it, and it's not that social media was less important, but it could not work on its own. It had to be complemented by that physical campaigning. What would I do this year if it was just online? If I had to run with just online, I would probably cry because I am a dinosaur when it comes to social media. So I think I would struggle. And to be honest, I was absolutely mesmerized to see what people have come up with in these online campaigns, because you need to completely reinvent the wheel. And previous experience in campaigning almost doesn't matter anymore, because you have to focus just on social media. And I think people have done a stunning job. I quite glad that I never had a Corona campaign, because probably wouldn't be here now speaking about it.
This is a great segue into my next question, because I can imagine that, the experience you had as the activities officer was useful both when you were campaigning for president and in the actual role itself, at least for you. And however, I can imagine it's been a big jump from one role to another. Have you experienced, that advantage in any way? And do you feel like it should be a factor to take into consideration when it comes to students actually voting, or is it not just that relevant?
Experience having previous being in office.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not gonna say it's not useful, because of course, even if you jump role, and of course, when I jumped from activities to president, it was a huge leap, because all of a sudden I was member of completely different committees and groups and all of that. Um, it is useful because still, like, the staff within the SU, which is instrumental if you want to get anything done. You kind of know the university and the structures. It does help you hit the ground running quicker, because you don't have to wrap your head around all of the different hats that you wear as an officer. There are a lot of things that you just know because you've been in the job for a year. That being said, you can learn. And like, we've all coming being officers for the first time at some point. We've all had to start somewhere. And regardless of how much experience you have in previous roles in the ESU, and of course, every campaign will make a point of saying I've been involved in this and this and that because it is important and it shows your commitment. However, in terms of an officer role, you don't know what's going to hit you until you walk through that door on the first day. You get into the job, you have staff supporting you, you have the other officers, you learn. So it's a good to have, but it's not something that you need to have before jumping into a role. No role, including president.
Great, and it almost feels like you're reading my questions because my next one was that, well, you became president a few short weeks before the entire world kind of like went into lockdown, and while you had to deal with the issue head on, the next officers will have to deal with all the consequences that come from it, and with all these unexpected situations and crises that just randomly, are hitting us. To what extent should students care about like manifestos and promises if we're constantly dealing with much bigger issues that we haven't, actually predicted? And if not manifestos, like what should they actually care about instead?
I think people should care a lot about manifestos, and I my manifestos of other people in the past have been criticized, rightly so, because that is the job of voters to like actively engage with what someone has written about policies being too ambitious or too out there. I think, particularly given that we spent so long last year crafting a manifesto that could articulate the needs of as many students as possible, given that I have a limited experience of what being a student is, because there are all sorts of students that just like cannot be captured in just 500 words of a manifesto. And you prepare that and you make sure that all of your points are backed by research and you put it out there. Everyone is like amazing, and 2 weeks after a pandemic hits and you need to throw everything in the bin. I was looking at my manifesto nostalgically because you know how like people look at old photos with friends. I looked at my manifesto just to kind of like remember what it used to be before, and I saw the amount of things that I have not been able to start, the amount of things that I wanted to get done and kind of like put out there. Um, but the fact that I haven't been able to make headway on it, it doesn't make it any less important, because ultimately that that manifesto was my candidate ID. So it put out my values, what I stood for, and where my position was on key issues. So yes, a lot of things are not going to be able to get done, which is the saddest thing that I have to say, because I wish I could do all of the things that I set myself out to achieve. But it's also important to read kind of like where a candidate stands on key issues. So even though things will inevitably change next year, they inevitably change every year because COVID is kind of like the queen of situations. But there will be things that crop up year on year that make it so that not all the priorities are achieved. But regardless, that's how you kind of like read through the soul of a candidate, and I think that's really important. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. Yeah, just wanted your take on that. Not saying the manifestos that don't matter. I'm just,
Oh no, I know.
yeah, I was, yeah. But yeah, I feel like now it's time to move on to our second bit we're going to be discussing the two key issues of, the SU revival and freedom of speech. So yeah, to Glenn and Millie.
Yeah, I think this next discussion links in quite well with what you were saying about dealing with unexpected crises. So as we all know, the past 2 years haven't been the student experience we expected, and the SU officers have faced very unexpected challenges too. And next year, when this week's successful candidates will be in office, their number one priority will be rebuilding the SU into a beacon of student community and good times. To this end, some of the candidates have proposed more freshers activities than ever before to welcome new freshers and the current first years who haven't been able to join sports and societies as they usually would. And there's extra emphasis on helping those groups to find their new members from next autumn. Obviously, because the Plug and Tub and the SU's daytime coffee shop and nights out like school and class have all been closed, the SU's income has taken a massive hit this year. Just like students, the SU will really welcome the day when we can all socialise again and that bulk of their income can return. But obviously it will take time to recover those losses. And next year, the SU's budgets, which cover things like sports, societies and SU events, will all be slashed again to try and account for these losses and recover. Francesca, would you mind explaining a bit for us and for any students watching about what those budget changes will mean for students next year and what kind of changes they might see on the ground in their sports and societies?
So this is honestly a painful thing to talk about for me. Well, the key thing is, as SU president, I oversee the overall financial situation of the SU and just the general SU finances, but also as chair of the board of trustees. So it's kind of like something that has fallen on my lap and has had to be dealt with. The key thing here is this is a necessity because of the restrictions and the closing of the bar. It has meant that our income is falling a lot, and we have had issues with furloughing staff, which has meant that we have not gotten back as much as we thought we would from putting staff on furlough. There have been a whole host of issues that have made sure that our financial situation is not disastrous, but it is quite tenuous. And the only reason why we're still afloat as a union is because we had very good financial management in the past, meaning that we could use our reserves to basically absorb some of the hit. And the university has also been really helpful in terms of supporting some of the activities that we've done, such as East Village. What we want to make sure is that the impact on the ground is as limited as possible, and that means looking at diverse sources of income. So we're looking at different advertisers, different sponsors. We have signed up to support the census just to get that extra income in. So we're not just looking at the situation and say like, okay, we need to chop this. We're trying to find other ways to replenish everything that we've lost because of COVID. In terms of change on the ground, there may be projects that have to take off more slowly. There may have to be projects that have to rely on external funding or alumni funding in the future more than core SU funding. There may be issues with student outlets. For instance, like Bath Time, we're having a huge discussion at the moment about how much print we want to put out in the SU. I'm not saying that the impact is going to be low, and of course that we can't exactly estimate the full scale of that. But what we're trying to do is to find alternative sources of funding and things that we can put on hold now from our central activity to make sure that that impact on the students is as limited as possible, given that students have had such a rough year with basically no in-person student experience.
Yeah, I think it's obviously a massive challenge, and I wouldn't like to be in your position. It's going to be really tough, and I think the trade-off that Millie was getting at here, in terms of discussing it in the frame of an SU revival as opposed to an SU kind of financial recovery, is that, in my view anyway, there's a bit of a trade-off between to what degree do we need to spend to bring back the student community and have everyone in the SU and have active and thriving student groups. Francesco, like in my second year when me and you were both on Bath Time, getting that massive crowd back when, back in the good old days, fighting for bringing that back. And on the other hand, dealing with the harsh reality that the SU is a bit skint, and it's what, £210,000 shortfall this year. That's massive. Yeah. So last week I interviewed the candidates, the current candidates for president on this issue, and honestly, I'm going to be a bit harsh when I say this, but I think it's quite important. Two of the candidates, Rochelle and Kamakshi, both kind of said they could account for these financial changes, and the impact could basically be absorbed by clever accounting and clever bookwork and cutting things that students wouldn't notice. My view from the conversations that we've had is that obviously isn't possible, and that they're saying that for one of two reasons: it's either a lack of understanding of the issue, or a kind of political move and a failure to, or a kind of an optimism that means they're going to try and not commit to cutting a particular area to avoid making cuts. I think Rochelle's clear priority would definitely be on things that were around, building a community and having places to speak to people. And Annie's, in that sense, Annie's answer, Annie, obviously an officer now, fully understands the extent of the issue, but wouldn't, funnily enough, commit to an area to chop either. So we're not seeing a clear direction from any of those guys. Kind of understandable, given that we're asking them to run a race and we don't want them to, chop their own legs off. But yeah, we'll see. No direction from them. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. And this is, just to get back to that first point, like, this is massive. This is going to dominate what they're doing next year. So yeah, we'll see.
Just wanted to add something really quick, because everyone's talking about, building a community and, doing all these activities and stuff. But if you don't account for, what money are you going to use to do all of that? It's kind of pointless to say, let's build an app, let's do events. Not like, I'm not shooting at any candidate specifically, but yeah, I feel like it is a big issue that should be discussed a lot more.
I absolutely see like all of the points that are being said here, and we are just embarking at the moment on that journey of like making our finances more transparent, because ultimately it's you all who are our members, and yes, like and you do have a stake in how the SU finances are doing, because like this is happening, this whole thing right now, under the banner of a student group. So everything that happens financially to us affects you, and we have a duty to let you know in simple terms exactly what's going on. That being said, there are still like things that I do not fully understand, because I studied politics. I did not study finance, and there are things that I can't even spell, let alone understand. It's also like I just if I may actually ask you one question. So of course, like all of the manifestos this year and the whole situation is kind of with that arrow of gloom of COVID is still knocking about, and DSU's in quite a tricky financial situation. Would you prefer to see a manifesto that is cut down in terms of ambition, and is just like actually a manifesto that says we will have to cut this area. If elected, I would cut this area. Would you prefer that, or something that sets out that ambition? Because we don't know. It may come to September, and £1 million just like drops on our lap, and we can suddenly do everything. But then someone has been elected who has accounted for a completely different financial situation. What would be your preference?
I think that's a brilliant question, isn't it? And it's quite nice for us to sit on our high horse here and criticise those massive ambitions versus, like, failing to deal with like the hard decisions. And I obviously completely, having written manifestos in the past, completely understand why that's being done. If you want to hear me being really harsh about all of the manifestos individually, go and read the article that we published yesterday, because I still feel a little bit guilty for how cruel I was there. But I think it's a bit of a line that you can walk, to be honest, and I haven't seen any of the candidates walk it this year. I think Annie's manifesto has a couple of big vote-winning kind of headlines in there. That app definitely being one of them, and there was something else in there as well that I can't quite remember off the top of my head. Or the vegan no, it wasn't a vegan shop. It was
The zero waste shop.
The zero waste shop. In my view, and I've got a pretty solid experience working with the SU now, those things, and in the university, I should say, those things are pie in the sky ideas, and I would take any bet that they are not going to happen within the course of a year. So good on Annie if she manages them, but I would say, and I think I'm saying quite safely, but it is obviously just my personal opinion, that those things are never going to happen. So I think in that sense, it's about walking a line. Before I let Millie speak, I'm going to give a bit of stick to the other candidates, otherwise it's not fair. I think equally Rochelle's manifesto is way too narrow and doesn't deal with, doesn't even mention the fact that we've got, you know, difficult financial decisions to make, and equally doesn't really give us any big outlandish statements that give an indication of the broader direction that they would go in. And that we saw that in questions to candidates yesterday as well, when they said they were given an opportunity to spend any amount of money on any project to boost the student community, and they said that student ambassador pay would be increased to £25 an hour, which to me felt a tiny little bit misdirected and unambitious, but fair enough. And then Kamakshi finally, I think, again, kind of unambitious, doesn't really capture the scale of the issues that we're dealing with at the minute. But yeah, that's me slagging them all off.
I think it's a really, really interesting question you make, Francesca. And when I'm looking at all the candidates, not just president, I think a certain degree of flexibility is what you need, because like you and the current officers have faced, you don't know what's going to happen. Personally, I'm optimistic that in the autumn, at least some students hopefully will be able to come back to campus and spend money in the bars and all those kind of things. So I'm optimistic, but I think what I value in the candidates, and which I believe I've seen from a lot of them, is that flexibility to accept that, you know, maybe their budgets will be a lot higher, maybe they'll be a lot smaller, but it's all about prioritization. So which things they really care about and which things they want to make sure get done above all, you know, whether that's the only thing they can do or whether that's one of 20 things they can do. So I think that was quite an interesting question that we've managed to put to them in the interviews and in questions to candidates. So yeah, I think you probably know more than anyone the need for flexibility in the job.
Yeah, for sure. It's also, like, I think I just want to say that it's also being a tricky, once you are in the job, and like particularly in the situation that by all means is absolutely unique, it is a tricky line of like having to tell the people who voted you in ultimately that telling them something that they're not going to want to hear, and something that it goes against their direct interest, and just like keeping everything behind closed doors, because we say in Italy, if it's far from your ears, it's far from your heart. Basically saying that if you don't know, all the better. It is a very tricky line to kind of like tread, and I think that like whoever comes in any of the positions, that transparency will need to stay there, and it will need to increase, because and we kind of started that process this year, but we haven't done nearly enough. We need to do more on that.
I feel like it's time to move on to our second topic, freedom of speech. So yeah, if you want to kind of take it away.
Sure,
Fine.
thanks, Antigone. Let me just get my, not that it's scripted, but let me just get my script over to the screen. So, in a move that feels almost as if it follows a solar pattern, the UK government took a focus on free speech in higher education last month and announced plans to introduce a free speech champion to police breaches of new policy in universities and SUs. Higher education commentators and organisations such as the NUS were quick to write off the announcement as irrelevant at the time when the sector was facing much more substantial challenges, and highlighted incredibly low rates at which speaker requests were denied. Yet, at many students' unions, approving the attendance of an external speaker to an event can be a laborious and bureaucratic process for student volunteers, with our SU's own process taking at least 6 weeks' notice. The presidential candidates this year are each taking a slightly different approach to the issue, with Kamakshi going as far as fully endorsing the government's approach in our interview, while Rochelle agreed that free speech was important and discussed thoughts around having a campus-based free speech ambassador. Annie also agreed that free speech is important and must be protected, but aligned with popular commentary on the bizarre timing of the issue and suggested it should be a low priority in this period. Francesco, could you lead us into this one with a couple of minutes overview and thoughts on the broad issue?
Yeah, I can. Very happily, Will. So I think that the first thing is that when almost kind of like starting with free speech needs to be protected on campus almost seems to imply that there is a free speech problem on campus and there isn't one. In 2018, a parliamentary committee, in 2018 it was still the same government that was in place, same party, different government, that found that there is actually limited evidence of free speech issues on campus. So again, it doesn't need to be protected here because the procedures protect it already and make sure that these things can happen. I've actually I have met the university's minister in my other role as a member of the Office for Students student panel. The Office for Students is the regulator on the board of which the free speech champion would sit. This free speech champion is a political appointment, so it would be installed by number 10 on the board of a regulator that is independent. So not only this is weird, given that we are in a pandemic and maybe we should be focusing on the livelihoods of students right now, but no, let's talk about free speech. It's not only really weird, but it's dangerous. It sets a really dangerous precedent of what independence means and to the extent to which political appointments can go. It is really disheartening to hear what the Secretary of Education has said, and basically conflating freedom of speech with a right to platform. And it was actually an MP that made the point really succinctly on an interview. It was like a small station, and she said, I can't sue the BBC because they didn't give me a platform on the morning show today, because she never had the right to that platform. She has a right to speak freely, but the BBC doesn't have a duty to give her a platform to speak. And the government seems to be conflating that view, even with speakers, and this is quoting the Secretary of State for Education, saying that we should be encouraging people to give a platform and to share deeply offensive views. So I'm not just weirded out by this proposal. I'm horrified, and I'm scared of what this could mean for students in the context of SUs, and for SUs, which will have to fight really difficult decisions, which is either standing by a principle or risk being sued, again, when we're facing such difficult financial situations. Sorry, that was definitely longer than 2 minutes.
No, that's fine. But yeah, and I also feel like another kind of similar issue to what you just said is that people kind of confuse freedom of speech and freedom of consequence. I feel like that's quite an important thing, that, you know, you're free to say whatever you want, but if, you know, you have some consequences to face because of what you said, you can't just claim, oh, freedom of speech, like I had the right to say it. Yeah, but, you know, what if what you said cost whatever? So yeah, I think that's also an issue to consider, and especially in a place like university where, you know, everyone's kind of like forming their opinions and kind of their worldview. It's kind of dangerous to have to deal with such topics.
Yeah, I think this is it's a huge issue, and I think we're right that the government's timing here is bizarre, and their approach to ensuring free speech is like questionable at best. This is again my personal take on this, but I kind of just want to bring it back down to earth a little bit and back down to our SU path kind of situation, because for me the national, I mean the government's done this. They've taken the focus and put it on external speakers, and that's been the issue in question. For me, free speech in universities is much broader, and you won't be too surprised to hear that free speech at universities to me means a free and independent and successful student media. I'm playing devil's advocate for a hot second, and obviously me and Francesco are on the front lines of this conversation in Bath, but I'm talking about a much broader national issue here. SUs have had tenuous, again, at best, sometimes horrible relationships with their student media outlets across the country. And in many places, we're seeing students student media outlets kind of lash out and say that the pandemic is being used as an excuse to remove our budgets and kill us off for good. And we saw that the kind of evidence for that kind of mass budget cuts across the board in a bit of research that the SPA, the Student Publication Association, did. Yeah, so for me, the issue of free speech on campus is much broader, and that really brings us down to having a supported student media group. What we saw from the candidates there again was quite concerning. Rochelle, full support student media. We didn't really dive into detail. Rochelle's a member, and Rochelle doesn't have the understanding that Annie does, but I'd be quite confident that they, given their approaches, would actually fully support student media, misguided or not. Kamachi didn't really comment on the issue. Again, a bit of a lack of understanding there, I'd say, from my point of view. Moving to Annie, we had quite an interesting conversation. Me and Annie have had this conversation before elections started as well. Annie started by saying that she would stop student media publishing stories that were of reputational damage to the SU, which is obviously massively concerning for me as the media officer, because we should be able to criticise and publicly criticise the SU. So that means causing reputational damage when it needs to happen. She did backtrack from saying that, and then ended up saying that she would only look to police us and influence what we were saying when we were being unprofessional, which I won't take personally. I don't think student media should take personally. Raises its own issues, but at least we saw some kind of deeper understanding of the issues there from Annie. But it's a really interesting topic, this, and on a national level, I'm not sure it's being considered at the depth that it should be.
It is a really interesting segue from the issue of freedom of speech, and it is interesting to hear that groups across the country have seen the pandemic as an excuse to cut budgets. I think that does rest on years and years of a very adversarial relationship between the officer team and the SU and student media, which I'm glad to say we don't have. That adversarial relationship. We do have a relationship with student media. I hope that came across. But of course, that doesn't mean to say that unless and we do that training at the beginning of every single year. We do the libel, the slander training. We do all of that training to make sure that even if a story has to go live without a lot of oversight from the SU staff or the officers, that it's not going to put us in legal trouble, because realistically, that's the only thing that we have to worry about. If a story is controversial and if it's critical of the SU, so long as it's not just saying, Francis shirt sucks and therefore he's a bad president. If it's something like that, personally, I would say I really wouldn't put that out there, because it's your credibility that is at stake. Or maybe mine, who knows? I think this is a great
It depends on the shirt you're wearing.
Yeah, exactly. But if it's a story that is just critical of the SU for all the good reasons, as it's happened in the past, there is absolutely nothing that we could do or should do to stop it from happening.
I think that's a great point and a great way to kind of wrap this up. I feel like we've been at it for a while, but thank you so much, Francesca, for joining us. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure Glenn and Amelia did as well. And thank you all for watching and listening to us. We'll be here all week covering everything elections. So yeah, thank you for joining us, and bye.